Hello everyone, this is Tim Dodd. Welcome to the Believer's Faith Challenge podcast.
Thankful to give witness to tens of thousands, yes, and to the millions that believe it. And believes, and I believe that God's going to let me live to pack it until all around the world it's been circulated.
Welcome to the Believer's Faith Challenge podcast. This is episode 101, actually, of the Faith Challenge podcast, and I'm Tim Dodd. And unfortunately, we don't have Brother Jean Manasseh with us this week. He's come down with COVID, and so I am flying solo. But we want to welcome you and welcome our guest here, whom we'll introduce in just a moment. This week is kind of a continuation of last week's podcast, where we went over some of the principles of working in missions in the end time. And we want to expand it a little bit. And we have Brother Ed Hammermeister with us, pastor of End Time Message Tabernacle in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, which church has always done a great work in missions, previously under Brother Harold Hildebrandt. And they're continuing their missions vision under Brother Hammermeister. And before we get started with Brother Ed, I just want to say one of the things that we want to do in an upcoming podcast, is do a session of questions and answers. So if you, the listener, have questions about missions, maybe we haven't thought about it, and maybe it's something that's been on your mind, you can email us at missions@bibleway.org. That's missions@bibleway.org. If you have a question, and you can send that in to us, and we'll be happy to take that up in an upcoming podcast. But right now, we're going to turn to Brother Ed Hammermeister, who's with us live from Edmonton. We're connecting from Vancouver to Edmonton today. And welcome, Brother Ed.
Greetings, Brother Tim. It's good to be here with you today. Good to be connected with the believers at Cloverdale Bible Way and our current association, as well as the past, in working and collaborating together in various things, missions being a part of it, and that's the focus today. But I'm happy to be here, be part of it, and whatever I can share. I didn't really put too much down. I just been thinking on a little bit today, but hopefully we can share some things just from the heart is what I'm talking.
I'm sure you have a lot to share, and we're going to try and pull it out of you. And so I know you've been the pastor there in Edmonton, officially the pastor for how long? About a year and a half?
Year and a half, I would say.
Okay, but
operating in a role before that, but
right, exactly. It's not that you're new to it. You were assisting Brother Hildebrandt very closely in his latter years as he was wrestling with some physical issues, and the Lord took him home. And we're always sad to lose a great soldier like that. But your association with End Time Message Tabernacle goes way back. And I think you've worked with Brother Harold over the years and traveled with Brother Harold overseas. Now, why don't you give us some of your background? How long you've been there for our listeners, and they're not just in Cloverdale, but around the world. People listen to this podcast, and they might be interested to know, who is Ed Hammermeister, this man, this brother that's now pastoring End Time Message Tabernacle, which has had a great presence overseas. And go back to the beginning, bring us into it, and tell us about your association, and bring us into some of your journeys with Brother Hildebrandt.
Okay, so in a very brief nutshell, I met Brother Harold in about 1972, just as he started a little house meeting. At that time, I wasn't saved. I was just a 12-year-old boy that sat in the corner of the living room and probably didn't serve to give him a lot of inspiration. However, many years later, it was about 1983 that God started dealing with me. And incidentally, God was dealing with me for a period of time. And I came to Cloverdale in 1984. At the time, you held your first convention with the intent of being baptized. And in fact, I was baptized in the log house that used to be the church of Cloverdale Bible Way. And so my beginnings go back to that. And shortly thereafter, I began to attend the church where Brother Harold was at. We began just in several buildings, but we began to become acquainted with Brother Harold's burden for the missions work. And over a number of years, he began to host conventions, brethren, different times. I'll come back to that. But as a young man, I remember God dealing with me, and maybe much like Paul, I felt God dealing. I spent a lot of time in prayer. I read journals and of various missionaries. That was very dear to my heart in the beginning. Men, secular men, Jim Elliot, there was others that went to different places. And I always had this fascination to be able to go out and hearing of what God did. So when Brother Harold, I'd heard of his trips and his burdens, and it was in 1990 that I actually went on my first trip with Brother Harold. I determined I wanted to go. I was gone 5 weeks. I was just a young man, had ministered only to the youth meeting, a couple times to the church. But I joined Brother Harold for 3 weeks. Him and Sister Marlene traveled together. And then I was an additional 2 weeks beyond. But it served, I didn't realize it at the time, but it served to be quite a training ground.
Right.
And it was very interesting. I don't think we can replace, and we maybe recognize in the time and the season, the experiences that God is bringing us through, how God was dealing with Brother Harold, how that would affect me even to this day, how I witnessed principles that came into play as God would begin to move upon me. Incidentally, Brother Tim, at that time, you were a pastor in Grand Prairie, and I was the one who was probably traveling overseas, and you were asking me questions. And today the roles have reversed, and I'm a pastor, and you're probably traveling overseas a lot more.
Let me interrupt you just a moment. You talked on this trip in 1990, 5 weeks, 3 weeks with Brother Harold, and then 2 weeks on your own. What countries were you in?
So I met Brother Harold in Kenya, and I met in Nairobi. I ended up, that weekend was a youth convention in the country of Kenya, and Brother Obadiah Kamwati had invited me to minister the Sunday morning service. He said it'll be for the youth. There'll be youth from all over the country, and which I did. And I didn't realize there would be 500 youth and 1,500 of the regular congregation there. So it was overwhelming, but I witnessed God just begin to use some simple thoughts, and I saw a very great effect to what was happening over there as the word came forth. So it was Kenya, and then from there we went into Tanzania, also into Malawi. Those are countries in Eastern Africa, and I'll share a little bit more. Tanzania, we met with a man, Brother Zephaniah Peters, a very dear soldier, and I witnessed Brother Harold would preach, the convention meetings, but I also witnessed going out into little towns and villages and being able to meet the people directly. It was quite a cross section of what we went through, and from that we went into Malawi, and in the country of Malawi we traveled rurally, not so much a convention, but went from place to place. And to give you a little context, for Brother Harold had been there 2 weeks prior to me. In those days, Brother Harold would go 4, 5, 6 weeks at a time, and he would literally preach every day. He had preached 27 times in 28 days. And when I joined him, he was very exhausted, and he'd been overcome fact, his voice had gone out, and I traveled out and actually took his place in a couple of meetings, which I felt insufficient.
Sure.
But yet God used it. And I never cease to be amazed at how God blesses the meetings overseas, exponentially, if I can use that word. And I say that because I believe that's where the heart of God is, as far as getting the last seed in. And Brother Harold had tapped into that, and I was able to be a witness to that. Brother Tim, you feel free to jump in. I don't want to just...
I was just letting you move forward, but you went into Malawi. Then after Malawi, did you go to Uganda on this trip?
No, actually I didn't.
Okay.
I hadn't gone to Uganda until just recent years.
Okay.
That was one country I never did go to directly. I've gone now, I'm going to just say, to about 15 countries, 12 to 15 countries in Africa. And but Malawi, it was Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, in Eastern Africa at that time. And the second part of the trip, where I parted ways with Brother Harold and went on my own, I was in Ghana and Nigeria and in Liberia in West Africa.
That's quite, we would call it a milk run. You went in a lot of countries on one trip, but you were gone 5 weeks.
So I was gone 5 weeks. I was...
You were single, you were 30 years old, and had a lot of energy. Oh, God bless you for that. Now, do you know how many, and I'm just getting background, we're still just in background here, how many trips you've made overseas yourself? Did it continue, or was it sporadic from between then and now?
It continued a fair bit. Initially, it was about 4 or 5 trips. I had gotten married. We started raising a family, and it made it more difficult to get away at that time. So there was probably about a 10-year interlude. So I'd say five trips for sure. Now, I will say this, Brother Tim. Coupled together with our missionary meetings, conferences that we had, I developed some very close friendships with brethren overseas. And I will just attest to, I believe they were God-given friendships. And they were friendships that stand the test of time to this day. And I will say real men of God, men that I consider pillars in the gospel. And I can say that by the grace of God, it has allowed me to keep a broader perspective of what we have.
Sure. I think
of what this message is, actually.
I think one of the things that people might not understand, and I don't want to ever accuse anybody of ignorance, certainly it's only the fact that they don't have the experiences of travel. Missionarying, if we can say it that way, or reaching out to these places in this age is definitely different than it was in the great missionary age. And that in those days, you're traveling largely to unconverted lands, and you're going in amongst heathens and different things as they begin to sow the seeds of the gospel in the Wesleyan age, especially in the Philadelphian age. And so but in this hour, we're traveling often to lands that have Christian backgrounds because of that age. So, for example, a country like Uganda or Malawi, or maybe to a little bit lesser extent, Tanzania, there is a big Christianization that has gone on, and they are now aware of who Jesus Christ is. They are aware of Christianity in general, and there's many different types of churches and denominations. And so we're not sowing the basic salvation message of Jesus Christ. We are taking an end-time message into these places.
I agree. I've maybe never, once you travel overseas, I say this, after the first trip I came back from, you can never be the same.
Yeah.
you begin to see, out of Matthew 24, and I believe it's Matthew 24, verse 14, it says, "This gospel will be preached in all the world for a witness."
Right.
And when you begin to see the context, as you alluded to, of the great missionary age, what seeds were planted, and how it set for the gospel that we have, that God has brought to us, the message of this last hour.
Mm-hmm.
It allowed it to fertilize quite well, and there was a receptiveness to it. But it's marvelous. I don't think there's anything like it on the face of the earth. And so I really would go along with it. You're going into heathen lands, you're going into places, but there's also a basis that you can begin to work with.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. These were the infancy, or the infant days of the message.
Right. Many of these countries received the message in the 80s, 70s and 80s, but largely the 80s. And,
right.
But if I can just shift a gear here, the Brother Hildebrandt traveling and you being involved in the church there, those were not his sole efforts. It wasn't just a minister traveling overseas to preach. There was other efforts that were ongoing in the church, such as, you already mentioned, the missionary conventions that he would have every 3 years. And also in a great portion, the books that you would print and ship into many of these countries that were able to firstly read English, but then also do translation work. So let's start with step one, the missionary conventions. I found them because I went north in 1985 and I started a church in Dawson Creek and was there for 10 years. And then the church kind of shifted over to Grand Prairie, which they're kind of two cities in a similar area there. And I found the missionary conventions to be eye-opening. As you said, many friendships were established there. Real brothers were introduced to North American brothers because of Brother Hildebrandt's acquaintance with them and having ministered in their churches. And then he invited them over here, and they attended these missionary conventions. And often they would travel in Canada, for example, and would visit us in Grand Prairie. And we would have services, even Dawson Creek before that. So tell me your impressions of the missionary conventions.
They were illuminating, Brother Tim. It broadened our experience in the Lord, in seeing how he dealt with various ministries, first of all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There were ministries and names that we could begin to bring to the forefront. Brethren like Brother Jeremiah, Brother Chicozy, Brother Dixon, different ones that came, Brother Jim Nyamichi, and seeing the diversity of God's leadings and how they took a hold of the message. And it's a life beyond just being taught. It's God working in his body.
Yeah.
And having these brethren come together. I'm going to go back just for a moment, Brother Tim. Brother Harold, he along with Brother Don Bablitz, took his first trip, I believe, in 1980. But it was a very simple call. He would look at the work that Brother Biscoe was doing, maybe Brother Lonnie Jenkins in different countries, and he asked this question, why aren't any of them going to Africa? And then a little voice came back to him and said, well, why don't you go?
Mm-hmm.
And that began to be his burden for Africa. He just followed that little nudge. And as he moved into it, it opened and opened and continued to open.
Mm-hmm.
And so we, when he'd go, you wouldn't see it. But when the missionary meetings were held here, you began to see what God was doing.
Right.
There's nothing like being on the ground in a country and meeting with the brethren.
Mm-hmm.
And we got a little foretaste of it when they came here, and we began to see that. And it worked not only on a ministerial level, but on our congregation. We received different people into our homes. But the meeting served to be an inspiration, to see how churches were growing, how God was dealing, and what was dear and precious to our hearts was equally dear and precious to them.
I think
brother, go ahead.
I think on several levels, I think that impacted me the same. One of them was to realize that this is a worldwide message, that this isn't a North American message, but I came to those meetings and developed a great respect for many of those overseas ministers as I heard them preach, as I listened to what God was doing in their countries. And I think the impact of those conventions cannot be underestimated, because many people in this hour don't recognize it. There was no internet back then.
Right.
There was no communications. If you wanted to send something overseas, it was by letter, snail mail, as we call it. And, post it and send it out a week, and then wait another week for another reply. It might be 2 or 3 or 4 weeks before you get something back from overseas. So the internet in the 80s and early 90s was non-existent. And I don't even know what year the internet came in. Somebody else might know that. But these conventions that brought these brothers over, number one, was a huge logistical undertaking. But it brought, as you said, as you heard from these brothers, you had them in your home, all of these things, you begin to hear things that you couldn't hear any other way.
Correct. It was, I'm going to, if I can share one little principle, when we would share about going overseas, you can share on a natural level. You're moving into third world countries, primitive conditions. In some cases, there was civil unrest, there was cultural differences, and that's one side of it.
Yep.
And it's very easy to think, because this is a North American message, we have the prophet came from North America, it was in our language. But when you move past all of those things, the change in culture and all of that, and you get down to the heart of where God is dealing with individuals and lives, and you see them being affected, and you see convictions just like you went through, you began to realize the impact. And one thing that really, I believe, worked well for Brother Harold was what I witnessed was the humility to go in and be a part of the people,
right,
to live in a way that was maybe uncomfortable to what he was related to, but he had a heart. And rather than looking down, I believe what made it very effective was that he viewed them as brothers, as children of God, not from a position of cultural difference that we were better, which would be very easy to do. But I believe he treated them as equals, and on that basis, I believe it made effective the work that God wrought through him.
I believe
when he
so.
was there.
Yeah, I believe that, Brother Ed, and that was my experience in even conversing with Brother Harold about many of the works that were overseas. Now, at what stage did the book printing come in? Were you there in its beginnings, or was it before you were there?
It had started just before I was here. If I can say it this way, Brother Harold had one of his residences, he had a garage that he never parked the car in. It was strictly a garage used for printing of books and storage, and sending them out. Now, this may be hard to relate, as you said earlier, without the digital, the internet.
Right.
We have to consider and think in physical terms. I go back, our family, I grew up in a home where our family received the message. My mother, in 1963, we had reel-to-reel tapes playing in our home. And and the tapes would arrive in Edmonton. They would be in your home for a day or 2 days, and you'd listen to it as much as you could, and then it would be passed on to another home.
Many people right now, Brother Ed, are Googling what is a reel-to-reel tape. Carry
Brother
on.
Branham would refer to it as the magnetic tape.
Yeah.
but it was it was amazing the demand. It was you couldn't even meet the demand for the desire that people had in their hearts. There was it was amazing, like to see how we had books. They were printed. Voice of God wasn't in existence. It was spoken word evangelism at that time. And we had the earliest books, and I still remember them. And Prophet Visits South Africa was written, and all of these things. So I say all of that because now that was the experience in North America at the early days. Now go overseas, minister, but have nothing for the people to have in their hands would be like the start of the message in North America, maybe many years later. Brother Harold witnessed that, and God gave him even the imprint, the blue books, the format that we had. God gave him a burden for that. I believe he also dreamed a dream where the eagle that you saw on there, Brother Harold was an artist, but that came as a result of a dream, the format of the 3 books. So our church began to be active in putting this in book form.
Right.
And traveling overseas, ministering, and then saying, the people you're leaving, and say, well, can you send us some of your tapes or books? And Brother Harold said it was in his heart to give them the at that time was the cassette tapes now, and then it was the books, and the burden went hand in hand with what he saw overseas.
Right.
And it became a staple for working ministry together with the printed and the tape form continually.
Right.
And
last week when we had our podcast, I was emphasizing that end-time missions work has 2 components. One is finding the bride, but the other is clothing the bride. And I think that's what you're describing is, it's not just a matter of going there and introducing that God sent a prophet, God sent a message and has vindicated this message in the end time, but then it's putting the message into the hands of the people. And I was going to ask you about the cassette tapes, because I remember, you have to realize I only came into the message the same time you did, which was 1983. And so, I remember in those days going to Edmonton and seeing these books, seeing these cassette tapes, and hearing of how they were ministering and reaching out to all these countries and sending them these materials. It was a source of audio tapes that was few and far between in those days.
It was the term, and I think you would know it, what we would call a seed library,
right,
of cassette tapes. And that was a selection of maybe key messages that could be put into various locations overseas, starting with the ministers, but also available to congregations. They would have libraries where they'd have all these cassettes. You could borrow it, you'd bring it back, you'd play it.
Yep.
It was just, imagine yourself if that it's so readily available now, it's hard to comprehend.
Exactly.
That the message wasn't available for everyone. You couldn't just search a quote. You couldn't do it. This was a lifeline. And not just the cassette tapes, but the books.
Right.
And, reading those books, I've gone into homes overseas where these books were marked up and highlighted and they're passed around, and it's the lifeline to the stable Christian life in this last day.
And furthermore, it grounded those early ministers in the Word till now we go overseas and we find these mature ministries. And that material that they had access to was crucially important to them, being grounded in the Word of God. You are listening to the Believers Faith Challenge podcast, and we trust you're enjoying the interview with Brother Ed Hammermeister. This is the end of part 1 of the interview, and we'll be moving to part 2 on our next podcast. But we've heard some wonderful things today, especially of the importance of getting the message into the hands of the people and the work that has gone on throughout the years to enable believers around the world to receive the message of the hour. While there has been much work done, we can certainly say there's much more work to do. Much more printing, much more translation, in order to enable the bride of Jesus Christ around the world in her own language to receive the message of the hour and be clothed by it, being made ready for the rapture. This has just been a small podcast and a continuation of the thought of some of the principles of mission work. If you have questions about mission work, you can email us at missions@bibleway.org. That's missions, plural, @bibleway.org. And we'd be happy to take your questions for an upcoming podcast and in turn answer your questions on the podcast. I'm sure you've been blessed by what you've heard today. May the Lord continue to bless you, and we thank you for listening. Until next time, shalom. Thank you for joining us on the podcast today. Remember, friends, the bridegroom will not come until the bride has made herself ready. She must be both called and fully dressed by the Word of God.
This was another episode of the Believers Faith Challenge Report podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you're interested in more podcasts and more content as it pertains to mission, please go to our website at bibleway.org. That's bibleway.org, and subscribe to our newsletter. We will make sure that we'll send you updates on a weekly basis of the works that the Lord is doing all over the world. Additionally, you can send us an email at info@bible-believers.org. That's info@bible-believers.org. And once again, we'd like to thank you for your support. This podcast would not be a success without you. Until next time, may God bless you.